right. Hi, everyone. Welcome this evening. On behalf of the libraries, it's my pleasure to serve as your MC tonight. I'm Krista Mastel. I'm one of the outreach and instruction librarians based out of McGraw Library usually. And welcome to our film viewing and discussion of This Land on March 25th, 2021. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening. We have a fantastic evening of talks and a film screening planned for you today. So I just want to take a moment and thank our sponsors. This event is being sponsored as a part of the ALA, American Library Association Resilient Communities Award that the University of Minnesota Libraries received, and also co-sponsored with the Mississippi Park Connection. And then you'll want to make sure that you stay tuned and stay towards the end because we will be giving away an ebook, and that is being provided by our friends and colleagues at the University of Minnesota Department of Forest Resources. So thank you to our sponsors for making this event happen tonight. So before we get started, I just want to acknowledge the place that our university campus sits in our community of the Twin Cities and broader University of Minnesota with a brief land acknowledgement. So the University of Minnesota Twin Cities is built within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It's important to acknowledge the peoples whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that words are not enough. We must ensure that our institution provides support, resources, and programs that increase access to all aspects of higher education for our American Indian students, staff, faculty, and community members. So tonight we have three fabulous speakers joining us tonight. We have Faith Briggs, who's the director and one of the featured runners you'll see in the film. We have Tamara Few from Mississippi Park Connection, and Hannah Legatzke, who's a UMD Ph.D. student. And I'm just going to give a brief introduction to each of our speakers before they speak tonight. So I'm just going to introduce Faith first, is a documentary filmmaker who's passionate about sharing contemporary stories about the better world we know we can create. Throughout her studies at Yale University and New York University Journalism Institute, and during her time working at the Discovery Channel, she is focused on representation and global citizenship. Faith currently resides in the Pacific Northwest, where she serves on the board of Global Works Community Fund in Oregon Wild. She was just selected as a 2021 Grist 50 Fixer this week, and as co-host of a new podcast called The Trail Ahead. I know we're all going to add that to our podcast list. Faith is a partner at the preeminent outdoor creative content studio Camp 4 Collective. Now we also have Tamara Few joining us, who is a program coordinator and volunteer outreach specialist for Mississippi Park Connection, the nonprofit partner of the Mississippi National River and Recreation Center. Tamara works to create outdoor programming led by and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color to connect with the Mississippi River, the outdoors, and each other. She also coordinates a fellowship program for young adults to gain experience working within the different branches of the National Park Service. She is a U of M alumni and past AmeriCorps member with the National Park Service. And last but not least, we'll be hearing also from Hannah Legatzke, who is a third-year PhD student with the National Resource Sciences and Management program here at the University of Minnesota. And she's being advised by Dr. Dean Current. Her research partners with the Rainforest Alliance and the Association for Forest Communities of the Petun to investigate how tourism management impacts community empowerment and local livelihoods in the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in Guatemala. So please welcome our 3 speakers tonight. And don't forget to stay tuned to the end, where we'll be giving away Diversity and Inclusion in the Recreation Profession, an ebook that actually was written by our professors here at the University of Minnesota. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mark to turn it over to Faith to introduce the film screening, and then we'll be viewing it. So take it away, Faith.
Kristen, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for having me. It's really wonderful to be here. My name is Faithy Briggs. My pronouns are she, her. I come to you tonight from Portland, Oregon, which is the ancestral homelands of the Multnomah and Chinook and many other tribes that resided here. I'm excited to show This Land. It is certainly a film that was a labor of love in many different ways. It took us probably 3 years to go from concept to making the thing happen. And you know, it's always funny because it's only 10 minutes long, but it took us quite a bit of convincing and explaining. I think many of you who work in academia will appreciate how sometimes trying to translate our topics of interest from a more academic setting into something more visual that people understand can be difficult. I think going into this film, all of the different things that I wanted to address at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, weren't making as much sense to people as they do now. You know, talking about diversity and personal history and the historical context of the US and the current battles and controversies around public lands and what that means in terms of people accessing them were things that at the time when we were pitching the film, everyone was like, you're kind of doing a lot. We're not sure we totally understand how this all relates. So it's been wonderful to have the wonderful reception around the film that we have had. We started out wanting to do a film around public lands. That was kind of how my film partner, Addie Thompson, who you'll see in the film, she was the associate producer, what we started with. We had heard about this review of the monuments of the national monuments by former Secretary Zinke at the end of 2017. And it was such a hot button topic in environmental and conservation spaces. So, you know, where I live now and the work I do now, I've worked at 2 different nonprofits over the past 4 years, and was still working at a nonprofit that brings veterans and inner city youth into areas experiencing some kind of environmental or climate related controversy at the time, called Soul River. And so, you know, it was kind of like my life, and I was calling friends from New York. I moved out from Brooklyn, New York about 4.5 years ago. And I was like talking about what's happening with public lands. And my friends, who are all brilliant in their many different ways, were like, we really don't know what you're talking about. And that felt really important to me. I think I wouldn't go so far as to call myself a science communicator, but I do think that over the years, I've really understood that who are we reaching with what stories is a part of what fuels my work. And so, you know, I have all these friends that are lawyers and work in social justice and are teachers, and they didn't know what I was talking about in terms of some of the biggest issues happening in the environmental space. And so I felt like there was a huge disconnect. But I also realized that I personally was, in many ways, I think, proof of concept that you can, you know, come from a place where, even though I spent a lot of time playing outside as a kid at summer camps, etc., I never really saw that as being related to an outdoor space. I never saw myself as an outdoor educator or anything like that, even though I spent every year of my life that from 12 to 21, I was working at summer camps. And from 3, when my parents were summer camp counselors, till 12, I was living basically at summer camps in the summertime. So it's just interesting how framing and setting can make you see yourself really differently. And so I think for me, like I said, I saw myself as kind of proof of concept where if I could, I spent a lot of my adult life in Brooklyn, if I could go from Brooklyn to a different environment where I was being invited and asked to care and engage more with environmental spaces, I felt like other people could also have that same journey if they had had an invitation to even get involved in the conversation. So that's kind of the background of there's where this film comes from and what pushed us to want to engage in it. I think often with film, you set out and maybe just with life with a very specific plan, and then life happens. So I think that certainly happened here as well. So thanks again for having me. I think after we watch the film, I'll be around to be part of the Q&A along with these wonderful speakers we have tonight, and just really excited to be a part of the evening. So thank you so much. And yeah, I'll mute video and we'll get started. Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
I'd never thought of myself as a conservationist. I actually used to think that conservation was a really privileged thing, and that, for people from historically marginalized communities, I had to think about people first. The battle now is saying, no, I am a conservationist, and redefining what that means. I didn't know anything about public lands up until about 3 years ago. Then I realized that there was essentially a showdown happening in our country with the new administration trying to roll back previously protected public lands. I'm a runner, and Addie Thompson, she's a runner, and one of the ways that we explore places, one of the ways that we see the world and connect with each other and connect with environments is through running. So we hatched this plan to leave on a running exploratory road trip from Portland, Oregon, down to New Mexico. We're running 150 miles through parts of 3 of the national monuments that have been points of contention for the current administration. I think people think that because public lands are for the public, all people feel welcome there, and that's just not the case. I think that's what people in conservation and public lands really need to understand, that they might feel welcome and they might think that it's just a spark that needs to be ignited to care about public lands, but it is so much more than that. Brown versus the Board of Education is, to me, one of the most important court cases to ever happen in this country, and it is what desegregated schools. It set the precedent to say that separate but equal, which is the basis for segregation being legal, is actually invalid. And what ended up happening was a bunch of the Black state parks lost funding and shut down. And so we lost a ton of recreational spaces for Black people, but it wasn't like overnight they were suddenly going to be skipping around in the state park. That would have been dangerous. They weren't actually welcome there. Is it 22 tomorrow?
I think it's 18 tomorrow and 22 the second day is what you'd said yesterday, but I don't know. I know the first day was shorter. I remember that.
It's day 1, so it's our test for everything. It's our test for navigating. It's our test for figuring out what kind of pace is going to be sustainable for that kind of thing. I'm really glad I have Jen and Addie with me. But yeah, I'm excited to start running.
I ain't fit to be no mother. I ain't fit to be no wife. Yeah, I've been working.
A national monument is a protected area of land that was protected under the Antiquities Act, but it's called a monument because it's protected in a different way than a national park would be protected. Oh, that was when we came out. Oh yeah, dude. Now we're navigating uncharted.
That's the problem.
It has water.
What it has the
it's
liquid
filled up.
inside?
Yeah.
Well, so all right, guys, what are we doing?
Let me
get to the second thing.
Yeah.
So I think that's what we should
This might be
do.
another like surprise long day. sorry. I just like I'm like, you know, it's hard today.
I don't want to talk about gender and politics and race in the outdoors on the trails and the mountains, but I mean, until we change them, we have to.
People like the current administration are coming in and saying, cool, we'll just roll back these protections real quick.
Just while no one's
While
looking.
no one's paying attention.
No one knows about it. When I tell people like what we're out here doing, why we're doing this, they're like, what do you mean redrawing borders? Or like, what are the monuments anyway?
In Grand Circus Escalante, I was so very alone. I was running in a place I'd never been before, and I was running in a place that's not set up for running. I had figured out on a map where I was gonna run, but then getting there, maybe that trail's not actually there. Maybe that road actually hasn't been used since the 80s, and maybe that river that you think you're gonna cross is dry, or maybe that river you think you're gonna cross is too high. You can't actually cross it. But 24.8, not bad. Not what I was intending.
Yeah.
Oh. My running background is on a track. Everything makes sense there. You know exactly how to run the curve and exactly how to run the straight, and there's not really any question about the elements. The elements are everything on the trails. You have ruts, you have inclines, you have, you know, crazy downhills while you're flailing, and then you have heat and bugs and cacti and getting lost. So I accidentally came the back way to the Wahoo Hoodoos, and they're crazy. Came from down there somewhere. Look at this. Hold on. What? So freaking cool. When I show up to conferences related to the outdoors, when I show up to town halls related to public lands, like I am 98% of the time the only Black woman in the room. I'm the youngest of 3 kids. My mom's white and my dad's Black. And my mom's side of the family disowned her when she decided to marry my dad. And it took a few years for our family to come back around and actually claim us. If you come from a group that has historically not been welcome, it's gonna take an effort to make you feel welcome. It just doesn't happen overnight.
The national monuments are a representation of us to currently be able to say, what do we care about? These are relatively new national monuments. Right? These are not the national monuments that were established in the early 1900s. These exist as they are now because people have decided to say, this is worth protecting and preserving.
People have systematically had their access limited, or more importantly, emotionally and mentally had their access limited to places, to spaces. People have told them repeatedly, you are not to come here, or that is not something that you do. And sometimes that's from within their own community. Our mother, our earth, is not going to survive if we continue to let that rhetoric resonate in young people's heads.
The ability to be a public landowner and to live in a place where we've made a decision that certain lands are for everyone, whether you live really close to them or whether they're across the country, that they're there for you. For me, that's really, it's really special. I think it means like we belong to this place and we're its caretakers. I didn't grow up with a sense of any kind of control about what the world I lived in looked like. I think the realization of being a public landowner means that we do have a say in what the world that we occupy looks like. It gives me a huge sense of responsibility to ask more questions,
and learn how I can say more about what's happening in my neighborhood and my state and then my country.
In a way, I guess this is what the whole journey has been about, is showing that you are welcome here. I know that a lot of times we haven't seen people that look like us in certain spaces. And so I'm hoping to be one of those people. And I want all my friends to be those people too. And I want everyone to see someone that looks like them outside doing something they love and be inspired to do the same thing. You are welcome here. You, as you, looking like you, talking like you, laughing like you, moving the way that you move, are welcome here. And this place is for you. That's the hope.
Thank you so much, Faith, for that wonderful film. Just a reminder for folks that you are welcome to submit questions. There's a little Q&A button towards the bottom of your screen. So if you have questions for Faith or comments about the film, we encourage you to put them there, along with any questions for our next two panelists. So we encourage dialogue using the Q&A. So next up, we'll hear from Tamara from the Mississippi Park Connection.
Hi, everyone. I have just a PowerPoint to go along with just my introduction. Thank you all for being here, and Faith, it is so amazing to meet you. I think I've watched your film probably now like 15 times. It's just every time the music and the words and the images, I'm covered in goosebumps every time. So I think you should be able to see a PowerPoint. Yes, Kristen?
Yep, we can see it.
Awesome. So yeah, my name is Tamara Few, she, her pronouns. And as Kristen said, I am a program coordinator and volunteer outreach specialist for a nonprofit organization called Mississippi Park Connection, and we're located in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the national park and the public lands that are right here in the Twin Cities, let you know a little bit about the organization that I work for, and how you can get involved with these two organizations. So there is a national park right here in the heart of the Twin Cities Metro, and it's called the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. It is a mouthful. The park was established in 1988, and it spans 72 miles of the Mississippi River. If you are on or along the Mississippi River between Dayton, Ramsey, and Hastings, then you are in a national park. The boundaries of the park were placed on public and private lands along the river that were already owned or managed by different organizations. So the park has to partner with those land managers and owners to host any kind of event or program. And as I said, I work for Mississippi Park Connection, and we are the nonprofit friends group to the Mississippi National River and Recreation Area, that national park in the Twin Cities. And Park Connection staff is a part of all aspects of the national park. We fundraise for park programs. There's staff that co-manages the volunteer program, and staff co-create educational and public programs. There are a ton of ways to get involved at the park. You could just go to the river and hike in different areas, or you could volunteer in a variety of ways. There are volunteers that work in visitor centers that share their knowledge about the park and the river with the public. You could sign up for a habitat restoration event, like removing misplaced species, planting trees, or collecting prairie seeds for restorations. But okay, it's easy to say, like, just go to the river, just go to the park or volunteer. But as Faith and her documentary just established, that isn't a given for people that aren't white. The outdoors and parks and green spaces aren't equally accessible and safe for people of color versus white people. And I just wanted to share this quote that I read from Myron Floyd. He's the dean of the College of Natural Resources at North Carolina State University. I'll just read it quick. For white Americans, the ability to visit a park or plan a hiking trip with little to no concern is a privilege that is rarely considered. However, for people of color, they have to plan trips and gather friends or family to go with them, or make sure they go hiking in groups. They think twice about going outside and going to remote places where they're not familiar with their surroundings. Black people and other people of color have to think really hard about being in outdoor spaces and being seen as out of place, because the white majority can perceive people of color to be out of place in outdoor spaces. I just wanted to share that because I connect with that quote so much, and I think a lot of people of color do as well. I think about these aspects every time I go into any level of public lands, whether it's a city park, county, state, and national parks. I personally rarely go alone into public lands because I don't feel safe or comfortable. But there was a new initiative that was created last summer in St. Paul called BIPOC Outdoors Twin Cities, and there's a Facebook group as well. It was created by Asha Softner, who works for the city of St. Paul in their Parks and Recs department. She organized around 25 recreational events specifically for and led by Black, Indigenous, and people of color in St. Paul. And I started going to her BIPOC events last summer, and personally being at those events, it's one of the rare times that I feel like I belong and I'm safe in the outdoors and just in general as well. So I've taken up Asha's program, and I'm working to expand it outside of St. Paul with Mississippi Park Connection, while Asha keeps doing her thing in St. Paul. We've organized a few educational and volunteer events that help participants connect with the river, the land, the outdoors, and with each other in a safe way. I just wanted to explain about these pictures a little bit. On this last slide, these images are from a tree planting event that we had last fall, where we partnered with the city of St. Paul, the National Park Service, and Park Connection to plant trees. This top photo is from a winter tree ID event that we had 2 weeks ago. And we partnered with the city of St. Paul, the National Park Service, and with a Native-led environmental organization, the Lower Phelan Creek Project, and participants learned about Dakota knowledge on trees and how to identify them. And this bottom photo was from a seed collection event in the fall as well. So I just want to let you know, if you're listening and you identify as Black, Indigenous, or a person of color, please feel free to reach out to me. I can put my email in the chat, and I can help you get connected to this group if you're seeking a way to connect to the outdoors in a safe space. Also just want to let folks know that I am coordinating a paid fellowship internship program this summer. It's for 18 to 25-year-olds from diverse backgrounds to explore and gain experience in different branches of the Park Service. And we can put a link to that, to the job announcement in the chat as well. But thank you again for having me and for being here. I stopped sharing my screen.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful, Tamara. Next, we'll hear a little bit from one of our colleagues here at the University of Minnesota. Hannah, would you like to share some of your research that you're up to?
Sure, thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks so much, Faith and Tamara, for bringing this conversation about conservation and whose voices are heard and what it means to conserve. That's in my research, I get to partner with two organizations in the Maya Biosphere Reserve in northern Guatemala, Rainforest Alliance, which is international with local community based within the Petén Department of Guatemala, where the Maya Biosphere Reserve is located, and the Association of Forest Communities of the Petén. If it's all right, I'd like to share a couple of slides here, just since I think it's easiest to see the area when we're talking about it. But the Maya Biosphere Reserve is about 5 million acres in total. It's one of the largest continuous stretches of forest in Central America. And it's also Mayan sacred and lands. There's some, and it's also known touristically for those sites. It's known as the heart of the Mundo Maya for the Mayan archaeological sites that are in the area. What makes the reserve kind of unique in its example of community managed forestry and local community involvement in management is something called the community concessions. So the Biosphere Reserve model that founds the basis of conservation in the reserve divides the land into 3 different land use types. And the darker green are national parks, which are similar to national parks in the US. And this yellow zone is a buffer zone that was intended to protect the reserve from an encroaching agricultural front. In the orange, and the part where I do most of my research, is an area called the community concessions. And those are areas where local communities living both in the reserve and just adjacent in the buffer zone hold rights to continue living and making living in the forest and making a living in the forest. Some residents describe that, you know, when this area was declared protected, it was declared protected pretty recently. That the reserve as a whole was established in 1990. So people who had been living in the park for a long time, some communities had been established been there for about 100 years, and they woke up one day and suddenly realized they were now living in a protected area with a potential that would dramatically impact their livelihoods. So they organized into the Association for Forest Communities of the Petén and ultimately campaigned to get these concessions, which are these 25-year leases. The communities that were living and long established in the reserve are staying there. And then other communities adjacent to the reserve are harvesting non-timber and timber forest products. Now, when it was initially established and this concession model was proposed, there was some pushback from conservation organizations saying, you know, local community forestry management, they were afraid it wouldn't work, there'd be rampant deforestation. What we've seen on the whole, actually, about 30 years after these concessions were planned, is the concessions on average are doing just as well, and in some cases better, than the national parks at protecting forest cover. These red dots here, this is data compiled by the Global Forest Watch, show deforestation in the buffer zone and also heavily in the west of the reserve. That's primarily occurring as the land's being converted to commercial agriculture and ranching purposes, and also some concerns with it being a drug trafficking corridor as well, driving some of the deforestation in the area. But these communities have been largely successful at protecting the forest. And in a lot of ways, that's attributed to the fact that they can continue to make their sustain their livelihoods from the forest. Some important forest products are the timber itself. They maintain Forest Stewardship Council to harvest timber species. There's some valuable hardwood species such as mahogany and Spanish cedar. And also gathering some non-timber forest products. Shown here is a cookie made of ramon. It's a nut that can be ground into a flour and prepared into a cookie. I can attest that it's pretty delicious. And then tourism, which is where I work most closely with communities and understanding how tourism's impacting their livelihoods. And I think one interesting point about the concessions is despite this overall success, there's still a struggle for recognition of land rights that's playing out on an international scale. In 2019, a bill was actually introduced to the US Senate that raised concern among the communities, even though on the cover it looks like a conservation bill and it's supposed to promote tourism. in the area, it would redraw the boundaries around some of the national parks, which would actually take away some of the concession areas that Aquafolk and the communities have advocated for. So really strong concerns that this bill was proposed without consulting the relevant Guatemalan institutions and ignoring the wishes of a lot of local community members. I can kind of wrap up with this quotation here from one woman I interviewed describing the concerns about how on an international level, sometimes the local communities aren't recognized. In a commentary about some documentaries that had been filmed in the archaeological sites, even though these sites are within community managed lands, the community lands aren't mentioned, and concerned that that's invisibilizing the work done by the communities to promote conservation. On the bright side, though, and one of the benefits we've been seeing, the oldest community concession, Carmelito, was just their concession contract was renewed in 2019, so they've got another 25 years, which is an optimistic sign that the communities will be able to continue the concession management. So yeah, thank you so much. I can drop my email in the chat. Thanks for letting me share a little bit about this research. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you all so much for sharing your research and your passion projects and just your overall enthusiasm for conservation and what is going on both at a local, regional, and global perspective. It was great to hear from the three of you. Again, folks, if you have questions or comments, I encourage you to pop it down into the Q&A feature. You can pop some comments in chat as well. I know I have one here where one of our attendees is asking if you all have reached out to any local public park or recreation agencies in your area for partnerships, programs, and other things. So I was wondering if each of you would like to speak about that a little bit.
I can just go quick. I've started partnering with different organizations that do work specifically with different affinity groups. So I mentioned Lower Phelan Creek Project. They're a native-led organization that does work in St. Paul. So reaching out to organizations like that. Also just reaching out to individuals that I know of that have expertise on specific areas. It's a lot of networking and reaching out to colleagues that might know someone. But yeah, Hannah or Faith, if you want to go.
Sure, yeah. So I work with an organization called Oregon Wild here in Portland. So through that, we kind of do a lot of different reach outs to different organizations. And then depending on which hat I'm wearing, I actually recently transitioned from being the development director of a local youth-focused nonprofit to being on the board, but I still help with some of the partnerships. So we work with Forest Park Conservancy, which is in Portland, Oregon. It's one of the biggest metro area parks in the country, which is really cool. There's over 83 miles of trail within the Portland area. And so they have a lot of different ways in which they're trying to connect BIPOC communities to the park. So I've worked with them a bit, and we also are working with getting more youth into programs related to environmental programming. Yeah, so that's kind of that. And then I liked the what's your public land question, so I figured I'd tag that on while I was chatting. I kind of fell in love with Oregon Mountain Desert Peaks National Monument when I was down in Las Cruces, New Mexico on Mescalero Apache homelands when I was down there last year. And then I actually just was back down there in January working on the podcast with some folks that I had met while filming this land. So right now that's a really close place in my heart.
Thanks. Yeah, I can answer. Public lands. Before moving to Minnesota, I lived in Seattle, so I'm a big fan of Mount Rainier National Park. In terms of partnerships. Most closely with my advisor, we work with Rainforest Alliance in the area, especially in their involvement with the non-timber forest products. Minnesotan churches are actually a pretty big buyer of shate, which is a decorative palm that grows in the area. It's collected by the community concessions, and some churches in Minnesota are actually one of the markets for that, for Palm Sunday masses. And then also in the parks, the Guatemalan Board for Protected Areas, it's CONAP for the Spanish acronym. I've had the opportunity to interview some park managers, and INGUAT, which is the Guatemalan Institute for Tourism. I've also got to speak with them about their vision for tourism development in the reserve as a whole.
Maybe Hannah, you want to kick this one off. Folks are just kind of wondering how do you see yourself in the field of conservation in the outdoors as a PhD student? What do you hope to continue on? And then how did our other two speakers, how did you find your way into this type of work?
Yeah, thanks so much. I think one thing I struggle with as a PhD student is definitely this wanting research to be actionable and really useful to communities at the same time as continuing on an academic career, like knowing that if I want to apply to tenure track positions, it's all about publications in a lot of ways, and those aren't necessarily what local communities are reading and the most useful products for them. So really engaging with community partners and asking critical questions about how do I make research useful? How, when I was in Carmelita 2 years ago, what products are they interested in? What do they want to see as a result of the research?
And then Tamara, I know you were in AmeriCorps. Could you maybe talk a little bit about your work there and how that led you to Mississippi Park Connection?
Yeah, I've worked in 2 different AmeriCorps positions. I worked for the Conservation Corps of Minnesota and Iowa for a summer, and that was as a crew leader, working with high school youth. And I really loved being able to actively improve the public lands that we were working in. We're in northern Minnesota. But the most rewarding part was creating relationships and connections with the youth that were on my crew. That was the start of, in my head, just realizing that conservation it's about the connections we have with people, and making sure that we are just bringing everyone along on this conservation movement. This past year, I was in a AmeriCorps position with the National Park Service site that I mentioned, Mississippi National River and Recreation Area. And I was working with their volunteer program. So again, it's about helping the land and also creating connections with the volunteers that showed up. Yeah, and from there, in the fall, I started leading the BIPOC events that I mentioned, and I just really advocated to the staff that I was working with that these are important events, and the participants, it felt like home to them as well. They were able to be in a space where they were with like people, and there's a feeling of belonging and healing in nature. So I was able to tell the staff, like, these are important events and we can't just leave. I'm one of just 2 people of color that are working at the park and at the nonprofit. And if I left, there wouldn't be anyone to continue these programs. So they heard it, and they didn't just say that they supported me in the program, but they actually made actions, and they have hired me and believe in it. So yeah, that's just how I've got to Mississippi Park Connection. Oh, I'll answer the public lands question quick. I really, really love Zion National Park. I went there 5 years ago, and did Angel's Landing, and that view was amazing. And yeah, just wanted to answer that quick. Faith, if you want to go.
Yeah, I think, for me, I got into media because of the summer camps I was working at. I felt like everyone knew every word to every song, like media, it so deeply infiltrates all of our lives. And as I became more aware of which narratives my kids had access to, I work with primarily Black and Latinx kids from New York City. It was just very clear that there weren't very many options. And so my thought was, how can we widen the spectrum of stories that are out there about us? So I was already kind of interested in media. And then when I, had the opportunity to I went to a very elite private boarding school, and then went to Yale University, which actually had one of the first African American PhD programs in the country. And I was a double major in African American studies and film studies. And so I was reading all of this literature and getting to interact with scholars and writers and all these people who were really helping me form my identity. And yet that identity formation also lived in that very exclusive space. So I was hoping that in some way my work can democratize the folks that we get to learn about, and the ways that we get to see ourselves. And so that, I think, was really what brought me into thinking about representation in film as being something that was really important. The environmental side of that was really, feels like a fluke still sometimes, though it makes a lot of sense now. But shout outs to my mom for loving LinkedIn, because she was like sure that LinkedIn was the key to everyone's career success in like 2014 and 13. And I was like, no, mom, no one uses LinkedIn. But I ended up getting found by someone at the Discovery Channel through LinkedIn. And so when I started working there, it was interesting. I was asked about conservation in my interview, and basically told them that I thought conservation was a really privileged endeavor, that people who didn't have to be concerned about their communities got to worry about birds and trees. And for whatever reason, they hired me anyway. And in my time there, it really complicated my understandings of where environmental work actually moved into environmental justice, and how connected we all were. Part of that was through seeing all the stories that weren't going to be told, that weren't ever going to be at broadcast quality for a number of reasons, related to which communities had access to the kind of cameras that they would need to share their stories. Who spoke English? Are people watching television going to be bored by subtitles? So there were so many factors, where I was at an entry level position. So I was pretty much the person who was the first eyes on every single thing that came in, whether it was Indigenous activists in the Amazon or like 40 hours of narwhal footage. That was my role. But I got to see not only which films could make it to wide audiences and which couldn't. And very often, those that came from stories centering people of color weren't able to make it to those wider audiences. And I think that really helped me see why, one of the other reasons why we're so often not in those decision-making spaces, because we're not seeing stories about ourselves in those spaces either. And so that's kind of what led me to knowing that representation in media about the environment, conservation, our natural world, was really important. And I think specifically what that means, I was actually on a webinar earlier today listening to Gina McCarthy, previous of NRDC and now in the Biden administration. And she was talking about how many people in the United States don't even have access to clean water. And she was like, don't even get me started on air, and we don't really think about ourselves that way. But if we can't even get access to clean water and clean air, like how can we have those connections with our natural world? So all of that is kind of how I found myself in this space. Once it became relatable to me, I think it's really hard to think about what my friend Christy calls big C conservation, where you're not even thinking about like little C conservation. And I think historically we value, like the protection of Yosemite more than we're valuing the protection of our drinking water in our local areas. That is like, there's a big disconnect there. So it's a big thing, but I think that's kind of what's drawn me to this space.
You, Faith. Talking about kind of how you began. Looking forward, are you doing any running activities? What's your next project? If you can give us a hint or glimmer into that.
Totally. Yeah. I mean, so we actually put out the teaser for the Trail Ahead, which is our podcast yesterday. And then the first episode comes out on next Tuesday, March 30th. That's been my biggest project. We not only did interviews with our guests, but also created 1-minute profiles, video profiles of each of our guests. Just again, on the understanding that visual representation really matters and being able to see yourself in these spaces really matters. In terms of running projects, I think everything that has happened in the country has certainly had me pretty frozen and feeling really overwhelmed. And I think there was a while in which I was really beating myself up about that. I think, all of us respond to trauma and grief really differently. And, there are some people in the running community that were out here like living their best lives, getting FKTs, which are like fastest known times on trails for folks that are not, as used to that kind of trail running lingo. And I was not. And I was like, if I can get myself out of the house, I'm doing good. So I've kind of learned to be really kind to myself about what I am and am not doing. I've been doing a lot of walking during the pandemic, which has been really wonderful. And I'm grateful that my body can do that. So yeah, not really big running objectives quite yet. Maybe a few things in the works, but nothing I'm ready to chat about just yet. But yeah.
Sorry, Faith, just quick question. Also, thank you for sharing that, how you felt during this past year with so many different just traumas going on. But where can we listen to your podcast?
Oh, it'll be on Spotify and Apple. And then we actually also made a page on the This Land Doc website. So I'll just throw it into the chat too. Yeah, thislanddoc.com/thetrailhead. And thank you.
And we have a couple questions. I don't know, Tamara, if you saw them kind of that are related to the work that you do at Mississippi Park Connection about, what kind of stories do you share during your events? As a national park within the boundaries of the Twin Cities, must have some complex history involving BIPOC communities and public lands in the river. And then another question is about involving about non-BIPOC people and groups. If they were interested in partnering or helping with volunteer efforts, is that a conversation you'd be willing to have? Or does it kind of decenter the needs of our BIPOC communities?
Okay, I'll start with the first one about stories. So at our events that we've had so far, we've made sure that we tell stories and do interpretation about people of color in history that have impacted the Mississippi River or the park. I'll just mention a project that was started last year. Park Connection and Mississippi Park Connection and the Park Service created a story map to tell the stories of powerful women who have impacted the Mississippi River, and it's called the Women of the Mississippi Project. You can get that in the chat. But it tells the story of women and women of color, especially, who have impacted the river, and their stories haven't really been told, especially in in the Park Service side of things. But the women were researched and the stories were put in this beautiful story map, and they're being told that on social media and at programs and events. That's just one important step that we're taking to make sure that the histories of people of color who have influenced public lands are told and prioritized, and just making sure that they aren't lost. Like, we have to bring these stories to light and actually talk about them and make sure that people know about them. It's a part of having representation in public lands, right? We need to hear about people of color who have done things in the past instead of just white folks. So that's an amazing project, and we make sure that we tell participants about these influential women. Let's see. Second question. If anyone wants to jump in too, go ahead.
I'll jump in. I think, regardless of what space I'm in, the question is very often, what can white allies do to diversify our movements? And it's a valid question, and it's one that I don't think most of us have the answer to. I think particularly for people of color, we're still thinking about what we can do to A, get ourselves out there, and B, get each other out there. So there's also many of us that have been having those conversations. I think, my question is always, who is already doing the work and what can you do to support them? And so I think that question is phrased really well in the sense of, can we amplify efforts that are already happening with BIPOC community organizations or those kinds of things? I think volunteering is always really wonderful. So I think there are certainly ways to do it. I think it's just, one of the really difficult things about the idea of diversity is very often diversity means we want more people that don't look like us in this room. It doesn't mean we want the room to change. And I think when you're a person of color going into a room that isn't changing, you don't actually feel included. And so you're kind of like a round peg that's being put into a square hole and told to feel comfortable there. So I think some of the questions are really, and also I think very often it's like, we as this group want to have equity efforts, so we're going to support the NAACP. The NAACP is great, you should totally support them, but also, what does something that's right in your own life look like? Because I think very often people are looking to do their equity and diversity work over there and then like keep going about their daily lives. And I think that equity work happens everywhere that you are. It happens at your kids' soccer team. It happens at the daycare. It happens in the park. It happens in those organizations. So I think, I think just thinking about equity differently is really important. I do think that, yes, volunteering with groups, but I think sometimes it's just visiting. Don't show up as a volunteer first, just attend the event, like figure out who's doing that work, see what organizations that are doing work with BIPOC folks in your community are doing, and show up there first, just see what's up. I think, I've been a part of a lot of trainings about equitable partnerships, particularly between funders and grantees, and a lot of times it's like someone saying, well, they weren't interested because they didn't respond to my emails. And it's like, you might be working with a community that's not going to answer emails. So you might need to call, or you might need to show up. So I think it's just, knowing that, yes, show up, yes, volunteer, yes, reach out, see what the deal is. Don't get discouraged if you're not immediately invited in, because there's a lot of reasons why there's been some fear around that. And there's a lot of efforts right now for people to finally try to take up space where they historically haven't been able to do that. So there are some places where, yes, that help is going to be really wonderful, or that presence is going to be really wonderful. And there's going to be other spaces where, yeah, it will be decentering, and it's going to have to be okay for that. And I think one of the big learnings that we're all doing right now is being more comfortable with being uncomfortable, and with things that feel that cause us discomfort, and feeling like, why can't I be a part of that thing, might feel a little bit uncomfortable at first. I think knowing that a lot of people haven't been allowed to be a part of a thing for a long time creates a little bit of a reframe.
Faith, that was so well said. Amazing. I just want to add that I think a misunderstanding that is around equity work is that I think some people think that equity work is about excluding white people from opportunities, but it's about elevating everyone else to get to the same level as white people in every aspect of life, which, Faith, you've talked about already. Making sure that everyone's at the same level of housing and education and healthcare, access to the outdoors, just every aspect. Yeah, just wanted to jump in.
Yeah, and I'll say one more thing on that, because I think there's a lot of fear of replacement that is going around right now too. And I'll use one of our favorite examples is like John Muir. A lot of people get really like uptight when you say John Muir was racist, and that feels to a lot of people like we're tearing down your heroes. I mean, looking at people literally tearing down monuments this summer, a lot of people, that's really scary for them. I think the reframe, once again, is as someone that works in conservation, I cannot tell you how many times like the mountains are calling and I must go have been at the top of like a presentation or a paper or something else. And when stories about Madison Grant and John Muir and so many other people who were actually eugenicists, like when that there were the same people who were trying to protect the purity of the redwoods, were trying to protect the purity of the human race, it's a lot harder to feel comfortable in those spaces. So I think that you can value the work that the quote unquote fathers of conservation did and still look at them truthfully and say like they were also flawed, and thus this movement has also been flawed. So I think that everyone has to be really honest about the good and the bad of the soil that we are now planting in, because we all know, like, if you're planting seeds in soil that isn't rich, you're going to have a really hard time. So I think that these tough conversations that we're having are really, it's working on the soil so that we can, have better plants or fruits coming out of that labor.
Thank you all so much. This was such a rich discussion. I just thought I would open it up if you all have a final thought or comment or theme that we didn't touch on. I know we didn't get to all the Q&A questions. I think all of our panelists are more than welcome to continue the conversation. You can reach out to them. They've posted their contact information in the chat, but do each of you want to just take a moment for kind of a closing thought as we kind of wrap things up?
I'll go. It's just been wonderful to be here. It's really nice to meet all of you who are presenting and see all the folks and comments in the chat. Thanks for the work that you're doing. And I think, I really love thinking about what our roles are and can be. I think a lot of times we feel pressure to be like what everyone else is doing, but I love the specificity of what Hannah and Tamara are both doing, because you've chosen a role and you can do that one really well, which I think is always exciting, to be okay with like choosing one role and playing it really well, because there's a lot to do and it can be really overwhelming. So thank you, and thank you so much for being here and having me.
Thank you so much, Faith. I wanted to say thanks too for I really appreciated the analogy of the soil and the seeds we're planting in the soil and growing, and recognizing that it's exciting to hear about this work going on in so many spaces. Yeah, and just, yeah, thanks so much for having me. Thanks for letting me share this research in Guatemala.
Yeah, again, just thank you for having me here, and it's been so amazing hearing from you, Faith and Hannah. I've been taking notes. I feel like I need to go back and re-listen to everything you've said, but yeah, again, thank you all for being here and for having me.
Well, thank you all. I'm sure if our audience could be unmuted, I will clap on behalf of everyone. Thank you so much for the rich discussions. Just a few things. You will notice that in the chat, there's an evaluation form that's been shared. So we would love your feedback on this event and ideas for future events. If you know of speakers or topics. We have an event coming up next month on Earth Day, featuring 3 of our faculty on campus that are working with endangered species. So if you would like to hear more about what's being done at the Landscape Arboretum or the Rusty Patched Bumblebee or Great Lakes Piping Plover, you are welcome to join us next month. And then this is the Instagram challenge. If you happen to be on Instagram, it's open to everyone. So you don't just have to be a part of the University of Minnesota community, but we are trying to encourage folks to get out into nature, which ties in perfectly to our message today, to de-stress, to get outside, just take a moment, explore your neighborhood, explore a new park, maybe get to the Mississippi River area as well. And if you snap a picture and tag the libraries at UMN Lib and then hashtag Nature Heals, you'll be entered into a drawing for a $20 Target gift card. We're giving away 5 of those, and we'll be giving those out on Earth Day or the day after. We'll probably run it through Earth Day, and then so the day after next month in April, we will do a drawing. So that's a little bit of some other library activities. Again, thank you so much for attending. And we're going to do our little prize giveaway. Thank you to our colleagues, Ingrid Schneider in the Department of Forest Resources for sponsoring tonight and giving us this great book on diversity and inclusion in the recreation profession. So this is an ebook, so you can access it from your devices. And let's see here, it's going to be for those that are still with us tonight. And I have a random number generator here. So let me generate the number. Hopefully, well, I want to make this fair so you all can see it. So let me make sure I'm sharing my screen. And all right, let's generate. All right, person number 33 in the list. And let's take a peek. If I go from the bottom, 1, 2, 3. Patty, looks like Patty Trinka. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. If you want to put your email in the chat, you can, we'll get that to you. If not, I can look you up on the attendee list. So congratulations, Patty. You are our ebook winner tonight. So congratulations. Oh, thank you so much. We will get that to you. Perfect. So we look forward to seeing you all hopefully next month. Again, thank you to our fabulous speakers. It was a joy to hear your stories. Thank you for sharing your expertise. I know I was deeply moved, and thank you for the work that you're doing and really inspiring all of us to do the work in conservation locally and beyond. So with that, thank you all again. I hope you enjoyed the presentations tonight. And on behalf of the libraries, have a wonderful evening. I know.